Alright, let's talk about Crimson Desert. This is going to be a first impressions video, since it's impossible to finish this game 2-3 days after it got released. Only judging by the size of a map, one can summarize this is definitely going to be at least 100 hours worth of gaming. So that being said, what do I think about the game, or more specifically, what do I think about its systems? Well, let's start with obvious, for the majority of people that is, which is graphics. Normally, I don't really care about graphics, because in this day and age, if the graphics are not good enough, obviously you're going to have a huge problem. However, when it comes to Crimson Desert, graphics are really good. I actually like how the game looks like, what kind of vibe it's giving me in terms of visual fidelity. I wasn't running it on max, because essentially there is no point as far as I'm concerned. I am mostly a gameplay guy rather than visual fidelity guy, so that's my reasoning. Also, like I said, it would be very surprising that the game looks relatively bad. And not to mention, you could have seen in previews how it looks like. Next element that you immediately get exposed to is pretty much control scheme. One word that I would use in order to describe control scheme is unintuitive, especially if you're gaming on PC, which is essentially where I'm coming from. Other words that I would use are awkward and overcomplicated. For example, if I want to talk to an important NPC, I first need to hold control and then I get a prompt by using the E key in order to talk to said NPC. Why do we have this? What was the point of introducing two keys in order to talk with the NPC, where in other games only one is required in order to engage into conversation? Moreover, if you know that you have a dedicated NPC that you need to talk to, why isn't the game automatically starting the conversation? You could keep yourself within a certain perimeter from the character and then the game is going to automatically initiate the conversation. Another blatant example how overcomplicated the controls are is when you are using a horse. If you want to gallop on a horse, you need to continuously keep pressing shift. So if you imagine your hand on the keyboard and you're using the standard WASD input, the only way that you can do that is using your pinky. So what you have basically is me hammering the pinky in order to achieve the speed that is required for a horse to gallop. And pretty much what the outcome is basically my pinky begging for mercy. Now, I ask you, why can't you go into gallop mode by simply double pressing the shift key? Why do you need to gradually build the speed with the horse? You can have the normal speed and then you can have ludicrously fast speed, because nobody wants the speed that is in between. Either you go relatively slow if you're going through town, for example, and you are role-playing and you don't want to bump into NPCs, or you go mega fast because you want to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. And let me tell you, these are not isolated cases. Holding control in order to kinda target where you are going to jump, or holding control when you are targeting using a pickaxe, or anything remotely similar that requires precision. I can understand that we have a button which tells you where you're supposed to jump, because there are jumping puzzles, and that's all nice and fine. But why are we having the same thing for, I don't know, mining or woodcutting? Simply step towards a mining node, press the key, and that's it. It's that fucking simple. So when I was reading that people said that the controls alone made them refund the game, I can 100% understand. My comment would be that the game basically fights you instead of empowering you. And if you have an experience that's going to be 100, 150 hours, even 200 hours, and you are continuously struggling with the keyboard and mouse combo, especially if you're on PC, it's only natural that you don't want to play the fucking game, because every single input is causing you frustration. It can be pretty much said that control prompts are just prolonging the game for absolutely no reason, because you are essentially non-stop trying to figure out how to do something instead of doing that thing fluidly, like it should be. And before you start saying that controls are fine, I would like to point out that even developers released a statement saying that they are aware of these issues, they are taking feedback from the players, and they will try to work on this problem in order to make the experience more bearable. So any type of argument, as far as I'm concerned, that the controls are just fine, basically is meaningless since the people who made the game acknowledged already that there are issues. Okay, so you kinda soldier through the controls, right? Next thing what you are exposed to is basically the storyline. So what is the storyline all about within these 7 or 8 hours that I already played the game? One word that I would use in order to explain the storyline is absolutely being disjointed. And I'll give you a proper example. So, you start the game by attending a funeral of this guy. He seems to be an important figure and everybody's super sad that he is dead. You do some talky talk with your buddies in this cabin and suddenly you get ambushed. There is some kind of a fighting, struggle, blah blah blah, and your character ends up dying. But fret not. He isn't dead permanently because we know he's not going to be dead. He gets resurrected for whatever reason, I don't know. At this point, I am still speculating what is the reason of this resurrection. And then all of a sudden you get teleported to this temple. You do something in that temple and then you wake up at the riverbank where this guy says he fished you out and you're basically good to go. In this particular situation, the first thing that comes to your mind is revenge. You want to get revenge on the people who attacked you. You want to rebuild your clan. And that's essentially what's going to be the main thread of the story. If you think Crimson Desert does the same, you are sorely mistaken. Because after that particular point, the main character absolutely has no say in the whole situation, what happened to his clan. The main quest doesn't even mention anything about revenge whatsoever. Of course there is a main quest, but you know what you're doing? You are saving cats, you are giving money to beggars, you are saving noble women from sewers, and you are cleaning chimneys with a broom. I shit you not, that's basically how it starts. And then later on you figure out that the beggar person and the noble lady are some kind of a sky wizards or something along the lines. And then you get teleported to the sky temple or whatever the fuck that is. You do some puzzles, which by the way are completely unnecessary. And then they reward you giving you wings, so you can fly, or rather you can glide. And I'm following this particular main quest, and I'm thinking to myself, what the fuck is actually happening? Why isn't the main character doing something to find his lost comrades? Why isn't he rebuilding? Why isn't he chasing for intel or something like that in order to figure out where the people who attacked them, or your clan that is, are? So you can exact revenge. But no, that's not happening at all. You are doing absolutely everything other than what the initial story thread was all about. I have never ever seen this in any game that I've played, and I played a lot of games. Now, if you don't really give a shit about main quests whatsoever, and you wanna kinda roam around and do all kinds of shit, that's probably going to be okay for you. For me, however, like I said, this absolutely makes no sense, and since I'm a story-orientated person, this is pretty much stopping me from getting into the whole story. Because at the end of the day, there is a story, but the way it's presented, it's abysmal. Naturally, after a couple of hours, you finally get to a point where your character kinda starts building from scratch and finding his previous comrades. But it's happening so sudden, there isn't any build-up, there isn't anything that would warrant this thing happening in a sense of a natural story progression. And only after some time you get to see these elements and bits and pieces. And if you haven't endured that much by that time, you probably abandoned the game altogether. What's also not helping when it comes to the storyline is the main character himself. The way I would describe him is generic, bland, and he is just there because he has to be, in a sense that there has to be something to push the story forwards. It's very hard to connect with him emotionally, to remember his personality if he even has one, because as far as I have been able to witness, his personality is as deep as a puddle that manifests after a short period of rain. This guy gets resurrected, talks to these sky wizard people, gets these magical wings to glide around the world, and yet never comments in a meaningful way saying something along the lines of, why is this happening to me? What is the purpose of this? What do you, sky wizard people, want from me? Because one can easily assume that it was them who resurrected him. but the game never explicitly said so. So you are constantly thinking what he would say and how he would act, but because he is a character that's already pre-made, it's very hard to connect with him. So overall, in first 8 hours or so, you could say that the story has severe pacing issues, lack of cohesion, and especially weak character arc. And you know what's funny? When you eventually set up your camp, you get introduced with this other character, this woman, just like that, out of the blue. She is there because she's running from something and, can you let her be in your camp for a while because it's a good place to hide. And I'm like, why the fuck would I want to play with her? I don't even know who this fucking woman is. I am barely grasping to figure out what Cliff is all about, and now you are pushing this woman on top of everything? Who the fuck thought this was a good idea? Because I most certainly don't think it's a good idea for obvious reasons. Because if I have to explain these things, since they are so obvious, then obviously we have a huge fucking problem. Oh, sweet Jesus, I really didn't think that I'm going to be exposed to this bullshit, but apparently I am. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about combat. What's combat all about? Well, considering we already talked about how controls are bad, naturally, combat is going to suffer. There's no other way to describe this. Also, for some strange reason, the game is trying to overwhelm you on every corner. Basically, too many mechanics are introduced too quickly, systems are layered on top of each other with no clarity, and to be honest, it feels like an MMO design forced into a single-player game. And that's basically how combat is. You have multi-button combos, you want precise timing, and you need to remember long input chains. Essentially, you are struck with poor onboarding, just like the rest of the game. Now, I want to make one thing clear. If the game has a lack of guidance, meaning that it doesn't explain everything and gives you vague directions, I don't have a problem with that. I will basically figure stuff out, mostly on my own errors, and then move forward. But not everyone thinks like me, and some people want a system that kinda gradually evolves and gradually becomes more complex. There is nothing wrong with complexity, but throwing everything at people at once is definitely a problem. Another thing that is tied to combat is difficulty spikes and imbalance. For example, certain bosses require full system mastery and give you little room for error. One blatant example is the goblin guy with the rapier that you're fighting in the main quest. He hits like a truck, and even if your gear is fully upgraded, or at least reasonably upgraded like it was in my case, you still feel like you're being punished too much. It took me several tries to kill him and I managed to do so, but if you are forcing a player to fight that type of a boss early on, so to speak, in the main quest, there is definitely going to be frustration, and you will 100% feel that this is basically an inconsistent challenge compared to the enemies that you fought before. I would add that this combat looks amazing because it's all flashy and you have a lot of moves, but it looks better than it plays because there is too much complexity, controls make combat frustrating, there is a poor learning curve, inconsistent combat identity, and messy, chaotic fights. Again, not great, not terrible. Next point that I would like to raise is all about quality of life stuff. For example, the game during conversations has a fast forward options, which is a great thing, but then you have other conversations you cannot even skip. You cannot access your inventory by pressing I. Instead, you need to press escape and then you need to navigate into your inventory, which is weird because you can just press M to access the map. Again, the inconsistency is staggering. As if two different people were designing these things, never talked to each other, and both of their logics, so to speak, were implemented. Quick Wheel, for example, is accessed by F1, where you can choose your weapons and armor. And when you are performing minigames, for example, the arm wrestling thing, you need to smack E like there's no tomorrow in order to kinda keep the tension with your arm. But then you are basically ambushed by the prompt, which is button R, in order to hit that sweet spot, which will make your arm go a bit on the other side in order to defeat the guy that you're currently arm wrestling. Then we have this mechanic where Cliff learns about the world around him by essentially looking what people are doing. And in certain situations that is fine, but he applies this to everything. For example, you go to a merchant in order to buy stuff, and there are multiple items that only have question mark instead of the said item icon that should represent it. So he needs to learn about that particular item, and I would understand if this is something exotic that he never saw. But this motherfucker needs to learn about bread, beer, leather straps. I mean, who the hell thought this was a good idea? Is Cliff mentally challenged that he never saw these things? Or maybe when he was yeeted in the water, he smacked his head so hard that he basically forgot the basic things in life. I don't really know what to say about this. This is basically one of those things that sounds good on paper, but absolutely looks dog shit in reality. As I was playing the game, I could very clearly see that it has an identity crisis. Game feels like MMO in disguise. You have system-heavy design, you have clunky UI and controls, and you have grind-like mechanics. Since we have been told this is a single-player RPG, you naturally expect other things. But what we got is basically a single-player MMO hybrid. And speaking of hybrids, it's very clear to me that this game is trying to borrow as many elements from other games as it is possible. For example, the Sky Wizard people are giving me Isu vibes from Assassin's Creed. You have big open world stuff like Red Dead Redemption 2. You have gliding stuff from Breath of the Wild. Then you have these various points of interest that you explore like you do in Skyrim. And then you have these investigations, kind of a thing that you do in The Witcher. Normally, I don't mind games borrowing from other games, especially when it comes to mechanics that are really good. But I would say that maybe too much borrowing is not a good strategy, because essentially what can happen is your game losing identity. Like I already said, we have an MMO DNA identity problem crisis, but now we also have a mechanics crisis. Because you cannot really point out with confidence, especially in the early hours, that this game has something that is core to it. I could go on and on about other elements that I also noticed when I was playing this game, but to me, it boils down to this. You have really disjointed story, control scheme is not helping you navigate the world properly, the main character is as bland as a boiled egg, and combat is inconsistent, messy and chaotic, but not in a good way. And when you combine only these elements, stuff is not looking very good for this game. Because if the game cannot capture me within a couple of hours, and instead requires of me to invest serious time in order to start noticing a potential glory that it kinda hides somewhere in like 30-40 hours mark, then we have a problem, because not many people are going to tolerate this, and they're just going to stop playing, either by simply refunding the game because Steam only gives you 2 hours to refund, or they will just put the game aside and wait for better days that might manifest through patches and fixes that developers are going to produce. Which means that if you want to play this game and you have issues with what I already described, you're not going to have a very good time. If you, however, don't really care about these things, you're maybe playing the game with controller, because apparently it's better than keyboard and mouse, you don't really care about the narrative, you just want to explore the wide world that the game offers, and you're willing to soldier through in order to uncover all the depth and mechanics that the game offers, then 100% you're going to be okay. In my case, however, since I want to review this game properly, and that means playing it from start to finish, I really don't have a choice. I need to soldier through this, because reviews aren't gonna write themselves out of the blue. So I guess it's up to you. You have this video, you have other videos, you have reviews. Make up your mind and decide whether or not shelling 70 euros, $80 or whatever the equivalent currency is acceptable for you. All I know is that I didn't have a single expectation from this game, and pretty much in these 8 hours I got severely disturbed and disappointed. But hey, that's life, you win some, you lose some. Anyway, I blabbed too much already, so I'm just going to end this video. Thank you very much for watching, and that's it from me. Until the next one.